And there are parts of an epic of Gilgamesh that date from before Moses, as far as we know, but they don't include the flood story. The flood story doesn't really show up in that until much, much later, and it doesn't really get developed until the 7th century. So when you're dealing with things like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Akkadian flood legends and all that kind of thing, you have to deal with when are the dates really, really there? When is the beef really there? And that tells you a lot. Same thing happens with Moses' birth story. Sargon of Akkad was supposedly one of the great Mesopotamian rulers in the 2000s BC, much earlier than Moses. And the record of his life story contains a very similar story to that of Moses. Someone's after the baby children, and so the mother puts the baby in this basket, sends him down the river. He's picked up by one of the daughters, I think the gardener's daughter or something like that, and raised, and he becomes a king. Very similar to Moses' story. Again, same problem. What we have that story on something that was dug up out of ancient Assyria in the maybe 750s to 800 BC, much later than Moses. So it's possible that they both have a common ancestor as a story, but it's probably not likely. In fact, what's probably more likely in that case was that it was not uncommon for that to happen very often. I mean, in a world where you don't have child protective services, or you don't have orphanages or anything like that, if a mother wants to abandon the child, probably the safest way to do it would be put it in the tall reeds of the marsh, where some other mother downstream washing her laundry is most likely going to find it. So, I mean, there are all kinds of things to look at here before you jump to this really insane conclusion that, the Moses story is plagiarized from the other one. In the long run, that's really not more than unlikely. It's almost impossible. Right. As far as the lawgivers, the progression of lawgivers, it's interesting. The movie presents these as a progression. It starts with Manu, and then it gets to Minos, and then to Meses, and then to Moses, and you can tell the names are all the same. It's really just the same myth that's been passed down, and kind of the name changed a little bit due to local influence. And again, just look at the sources. Look where they come from. Manu is Indian. What we have of his laws were not compiled until much later after Moses. We don't even know if there really was a Manu. Minos of Crete, probably one of my favorite ones just because of what information we have of him. Again, a much later legend attesting to his existence. And Meses in Egypt, same problem. We don't have hardly any historical data. And their names are not always as clear as they're presented in the movie. So what you really have is you have bits and fragments that are presented as really solid historical evidence creating a progression, and none of it has any basis in fact whatsoever. And of course what else I do there is I go back and I say, what do we have from these guys? Let's compare them. If there really is a historical progression, there should be a progression also in the content of their laws. And that's why I say Minos is my favorite, because he blows this out of the water. The Cretan, which is kind of Proto-Greek, if you will, Aristotle talks about the early laws of Minos. He was a communist. All food rations were doled out by the king according to his whim. Women were not allowed to live with men because they were afraid that they would produce too many children. And so they lived in isolation as far as the sexes go.
I already don't like him.
Huh?
I already don't like him.
Yeah, I can't stand that idea, but it gets worse. In order to take care of the inevitable lusts that would happen among these isolated men, they gave them the young boys and allowed them to sleep together. So you see already there's this entire contrast between this one group of laws and what Moses gives us much later.
Sure.
So now there is the argument that the Ten Commandments parallel the laws of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Again, this is so coincidental and so minor of a parallel that it's not hardly worth talking about. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there are hundreds of laws, hundreds of don't do this and don't do that are so idiotic, if for lack of a better word. You're not allowed to, according to the law, you're not allowed to catch a fish using bait made from the meat of the same type of fish. Okay, that's a law. God said so. Go to And there are tons of those. You're not allowed to raise your voice, according to the Egyptian Book of Dead. Where it does overlap with the Ten Commandments, it is the most common types of laws that show up in every law, just about across the world and across all of history. Don't kill, don't lie. The very common things that, according to the Bible, are supposed to be written on the hearts of men, even though we suppress them. Okay, so the Egyptian Book of the Dead is so funny to me because this thing is almost always written on the outsides of coffins, or on the insides of coffins in some cases, because according to Egyptian mythology, when you die, you wake up in the other world and you have to go stand before Isis, who is their god of judgment. And he asks you all this question, and you have to be able to recite all of those lists of laws and say that I did not do this. You have to be able to say that before ISIS. So I've got this vision in my head of a guy standing there trembling in his shoes, not able to remember that he didn't raise his voice, or he didn't catch fish with this certain type of bait, or he didn't do this or do that. And so these laws were written on the insides of coffins so that he would have something to remember by when he gets to the other side, which is, of course, why there's no law against using a cheat sheet on your homework.
Right.
Because when you stand before ISIS, you have to say all this. I mean, it's so far out in left field that to draw a parallel between that and the Ten Commandments, you really lose your credibility.
It reminds me of a guy back in 1992 that was doing parallels. This is when Bill Clinton was running for president, of course, the first time, but the Republican had not been decided yet. You know what? I got to make sure I got my year right. It might be 96. No, it was 92, because that's when Pat Buchanan was running against George Bush the first time.
Well, the Clinton years are all a blur. So
yeah, they are a blur. And the older I get, the worse it gets. But anyway,
and now they're back. So anyway,
let me put it to you this way: it was one time when Pat Buchanan was running for president. This guy on some TV show was doing 8 similarities between Pat Buchanan and Adolf Hitler. Needless to say, he didn't like Pat Buchanan. And, I mean, the parallels that he brought up were so absurd. I mean, I could have done them. Pat Buchanan liked yogurt. Adolf Hitler liked yogurt. I mean, that's how absurd it was. And people want to try, through this fallacy of generalization, to connect dots that really aren't there when you start getting down and studying it. But, of course, most people today, I believe, are trained. They're trained to be programmers. I mean, let me take that back. They're trained to be programmed. It's funny, Joel. I've often wondered why we call television programming.
Yeah.
Who's being programmed? And I think our society today, we have a tendency to just bring everything in, soak everything in, not question it, at least too deep, and just accept it on face value. And
that reminds me of something I heard one of the creationist arguers bring up one time, one of his talks. He said, David in the Psalms, he says, Lord, I go out and look at the heavens and I muse. And he says that word muse there, which is, kind of an old King James word. He said, you know what that really means? It means to think, to meditate. And if you think about how our language is structured, we have words, when you put an A on the front of something, you negate it.
Right.
Take the word theism, for example. A theist is someone who believes in God. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God. Well, we have a word like that with muse, if you think about it. We have the word amuse, which means what?
Non-thinking. No thinking.
It means don't think.
Right.
So, just keep that in mind.
Right. Well, let's do this, brother, real quick. I want to take another break, and we'll be back in just a moment with Joel McDurmon.
You have reached NiceseeandCouncil.com. We are unable to take your call at this time. Please leave a message and we'll return your call as soon as possible. Thank you and God bless.
Hey guys, Robert Andrews calling you. Hey, I just want to tell you how much I appreciated that DVD, Marks of a Cult. That thing is dynamite. And I've seen some other stuff like this, but this, hands down, is the best I've ever seen. So I just want to let you know, appreciate your work, and you guys are great. Super, super job. Thanks again. Bye now.
Order Marks of a Cult by visiting us on the web at www.nicenecouncil.com. Okay, and we're back with Joel McDurmon. Joel, you still with us?
I'm here.
I'm not going to ask you if you had been raptured, because I know you haven't now. Let's go ahead in this last segment. I want to ask you, what about the claim of the movie that Christianity, and not just the movie, I mean, you hear this from numerous sources, even inside of the body of Christ, that Christianity was hijacked by the Emperor Constantine and kind of became a tool of the state of social control.
Yeah, that's one of the claims that's prosecuted. And of course, it really is, one of those things you hear over and over. And this is not a defense of Constantine. He was not the greatest guy out there. And there are some shadowy things about his conversion and some of the stories that are told about him. Even though Eusebius, was kind of his great cheerleader. Eusebius, the father of church history. However, there's just really no solid evidence that, especially the way it's presented. They kind of piggyback on the work of the modern atheists who claim that religion is the root of all evil. And they're able to hold this claim that wherever Christianity has gone in history, it's held people in ignorance. It's suppressed the advance of science and reason, and it's caused the Dark Ages. It's caused all these bloodthirsty wars and things like that.
Yeah, before you answer the question about Constantine, since you brought this up, one of the things I find that Christianity has not done enough, specifically in our modern apologetical era, is, okay, followers of Christ are not inspired, infallible, or inerrant. We're not
Absolutely.
perfect. We do make mistakes. In fact, sometimes we commit grievous sin. You mentioned King David, Moses taking credit for a miracle, Peter denying the Lord Jesus Christ, whatever the case may be. The problem is that modern day empirical science is based upon an epistemology, a theory of knowledge that is as much based on faith, if not more so, blind faith, than Christianity. And atheism, is it not a religion? I mean, these guys
Absolutely.
want
The way it's prosecuted, the way it's carried out, that's true. Science is based on faith claims, and atheism has to overlook so much in order to keep up its PR.
right. So it's not.
What's really helped atheism is the fact that Islam is in the news, and that has caused a lot of crime and a lot of war and a lot of terrorism, and that turns people against religion in general,
Right.
which is about as big a logical fallacy as you can make, but it happens, and so the atheists have been able to sell hundreds and thousands of books.
Right, Christianity has had the same problem with the scandals of the televangelist in the 1980s, where all of Christianity was maligned because of the shortcomings of men like Jimmy Swaggart and who was the other guy? Jim Bakker.
Yeah, Jim Bakker and some others.
And so
what gets forgotten in a lot of that is the good that Jimmy Swaggart did. I mean, the gospel got to places via satellite that it still doesn't reach today.